Good afternoon, everyone. So I welcome you all to the CCR by Department of Medicine, Medicine Unit 2 on flaccidity, who is to blame. So the case will be presented by Shubham and the review of literature shall be done by Dr. Harsh. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everyone present. So I'll start the case. So this case is of a 14-year-old girl who's a student in grade 9 and she's a resident of West Delhi with no prior comorbidities. She presented to us with chief complaints of pain in both the lower limbs for a duration of 1 day. The pain was dull aching, non-localized, non-radiating, non-shifting in nature. Around 4 hours later of the onset of pain, she started developing weakness in both her lower limbs. Thereafter, it progressed to involve weakness of the upper limbs. So it was an ascending type of weakness, predominantly in the proximal than the distal limbs. The weakness began in the right lower limb, which was followed by an hour later by similar weakness developing in the left lower limb also. Around 1.5 later, she started developing weakness in both her upper limbs as well. So it was an ascending type of weakness, which was proximal more than distal. Coming to the negative history, she denied any history of seizures, headache, or vomiting. There was no history of any cranial nerve deficits such as loss of sense of smell, visual disturbances, diplopia, or any other complaint. There was no history of any loss of bladder or bowel control loss and no history of band-like sensation over the back. She denied any shooting pain in the lower limbs or any claudication pain, no history of sensory deficits, and no history of diurnal variation of weakness. In addition to that, there was no history of trauma, no history of fever. There was no history of preceding diarrhea or no history of recent vaccination, keeping in mind the historic possibility of a Guillain-Barre syndrome. There was no history of any recent intake of carbohydrate-rich food as well. Apart from this, there was no history of similar episodes in the past. There was no significant drug history or any history of exposure to any toxins. Dietary history was remarkable for a poor intake of nutrient-rich foods and dairy products and her predilection for savory food items. Talking about the family history, she was born out of a non-consanguineous marriage. There was no history of any similar illness or episodic weakness in any of the family members, apart from the index case. She was the youngest of her siblings and none of the other siblings were involved. She was conscious, alert, and well-oriented to time, place, and person. The general physical examination was unremarkable, and vitally she was stable. Coming to the neurological examination, her higher mental functions and cranial nerve functions were intact. However, coming to the motor examination, she had significantly reduced tone in both her upper limbs as well as her lower limbs bilaterally. So there was gross hypotonia. However, the bulk was bilaterally equal in both the upper limbs as well as the lower limbs, thereby indicating an acute insult. The motor power was reduced all throughout her body. It was predominantly proximal than distal weakness, and even neck muscle was also involved. The deep tendon reflexes were also absent in both the upper limbs as well as the lower limbs. All the jerks were absent except for the incidental presence of a knee jerk, which was 1+ and not significant. Bilateral planters were mute and there was no evidence of any abnormal movements. Other neurological examination and systemic examination were essentially within normal limits. So trying to localize it in the neuraxis, it could be a disorder in the brain, namely a brainstem stroke. However, there was no history of any seizures, diarrhea, seizures, vomiting, or headache, or any cranial nerve deficit, so this seems to be a remote possibility. Well, moving ahead, it could be a spinal cord disorder, namely a cervical myelopathy. However, there was no history of any trauma, no history of infection, and also no history of any loss of bladder bowel control, which goes against a spinal cord pathology. So we rule out. Moving ahead, it could be a peripheral nerve disorder. Historically speaking, it's an ascending type of weakness, and so we do keep a possibility of Guillain-Barre syndrome in this case. It could be a neuromuscular junction pathology, namely a myasthenic crisis presenting first time. OP poisoning and botulism is also a possibility. However, there is no history suggestive of any toxin exposure or infection. It could very well be a muscle disease, especially periodic paralysis seems to be a likely possibility since it's the first time she's presenting at a very young age. So it could be a possibility. So we'd like to keep these DDs. So that leads us to believe that is the neuromuscular system to be blamed. So we kept the possibilities of a Guillain-Barré syndrome, a hypokalemic or a thyrotoxic periodic paralysis. And lower down the list, we would also like to keep the DDs as maybe a transverse myelitis or myasthenic crisis. However, the routine investigations were remarkable for a severely reduced potassium level of around 2.1. The calcium was also on the lower side of normal, and she had significant hypophosphatemia. The uric acid was also on the lower side, and she had hyperuricemia as well. The ECG was remarkable for presence of changes of hypokalemia, which were QT prolongation, flattened T waves and U waves, which is very well explained on the basis of the severe hypokalemia that she had. Since we had also kept a possibility of thyrotoxic periodic paralysis, we went ahead with thyroid testing of the patient. However, she was essentially euthyroid. But what we found was that she had severe vitamin D deficiency below the detection limits and a secondary hyperparathyroidism as well. So what do we have till now? We have a 14-year-old female who's presenting for the first time to us with acute onset lower motor neuron quadriparesis, essentially flaccid in nature, with severe hypokalemia with ECG changes, hypouricemia, hypophosphatemia, as well as vitamin D deficiency. We tried to trace the diagnosis of the patient by working on the lines and working on the lines of management and approach to hypokalemia. Indeed, hypokalemia is known to cause muscle weakness at levels that are less than 2.5 milliequivalent per liter, and it is essentially an ascending type of weakness, and it may even be severe enough to produce paralysis. The treatment would be potassium administration with rapid correction of weakness after administration of potassium. So that's how we managed the patient. Since she had severe hypokalemia with ECG changes and paralysis, a central line was inserted under aseptic precautions and IV potassium replacement was done. Within 12 hours of replacement of potassium, she regained full power from 1/5 to 5/5 in all her lower limbs, and she was back on her feet. However, when she was back on her feet, we made her stand and we noticed that there was a genu valgum or knock-knee deformity present. However, the height and weight were essentially between -1 to -2 standard deviation and not satisfying the criteria of a short stature. And now I would like to call on the radiologist for commenting on the radiograph that we got done.
So we reviewed the skeletal radiographs. Essentially, all the radiographs appears to be normal. They have normal bone density. However, in the lower limb radiograph, we see there is presence of increased the hip, knee, and ankle angle, suggestive of the genu valgum, which is highlighting the same clinical evidence present in the patient.
Thank you, sir. Essentially, other skeletal survey was within normal limits with no frank evidence of rickets, probably explained by her post-pubertal age, but she definitely had a genu valgum deformity. So fitting the puzzle together, we have an acute onset flaccid quadriparesis. We also have severe hypokalemia with ECG changes. We have vitamin D deficiency, rickets, and hypouricemia. Let's again try to work on the lines of potassium. So that makes us to question, is potassium the answer? So whenever we have a patient with hypokalemia, that is potassium levels less than 3.5 milliequivalent per liter, we have to question ourselves three things. Whether there is any evidence of low intake of potassium that could have led to the hypokalemia. Since she did not have any history of starvation or clay ingestion, this seems to be a less down possibility. Then we have to question ourselves whether it is a transcellular shift. We all know that insulin is known to cause significant hypokalemia, so an insulin excess, use of beta-2 agonists for various respiratory disorders, hyperthyroidism, barium intoxication, theophylline are known to cause transcellular shifting and hypokalemia. Well, this was not the case in our case. So, and the third thing that we have to question ourselves is whether there is any increased losses of potassium that could lead to hypokalemia. Whenever we are evaluating a patient who we think have increased losses of potassium, we have two contours of the potassium excretion. So it could be an extra-renal loss or it could be a renal loss. So for that, what we do basically in our setting is a urine potassium testing for the patient. So urine potassium testing, if it is less than 15 millimole per day, that is suggestive of an extra-renal loss. On the contrary, a loss more than 15 millimole per day suggests a renal loss. So we got the urine potassium testing done for her. The 24-hour urine was collected and appropriate levels of potassium were computed. And we found that she had significant renal losses, and her losses were on the renal loss side of potassium. So that made us to believe that it was a renal loss of potassium that led to hypokalemia. The next step would be to calculate the transtubular potassium gradient. We went ahead with calculation of the transtubular potassium gradient of our patient, and we found it to be 7.62. Now, going by the textbook algorithm, when the transtubular potassium gradient is more than 4, that indicates that there is distal potassium secretion, and that made us to assess her blood pressure. Her blood pressure was found to be on the normal side, and that's when we realized that we should have checked the acid-base status of the patient. So we checked the acid-base status of the patient, and what was remarkable was that she had significant acidosis with severely reduced bicarbonate levels and hypokalemia, and she had a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis with respiratory compensation. So whenever we have a patient with hypokalemia and we find the patient to be having metabolic acidosis, the differentials in our mind should be a renal tubular acidosis or a diabetic ketoacidosis or any drug intake. From our case point of view, this seemed to be a renal tubular acidosis, as she had no other clues to support the other. So that's how we delved on the diagnosis of severe hypokalemia manifesting as hypokalemic paralysis with ECG changes due to a renal tubular acidosis. So that makes us to believe whether the kidneys are at fault now. So whenever we have a patient with renal tubular acidosis, the algorithmic testing tells us to test the urine pH of the patient, the serum potassium, which I've already done, and a bicarbonate loading test should be done. Bicarbonate loading test could not be done in our case due to non-availability, but we went ahead with other testing, and what we found that the urine pH of the patient was around 5, that is on the lower side, indicating the distal acidification was normal, but somewhere proximal the defect must have been. And the serum potassium was on the normal side, and that's how we diagnosed the patient as being having proximal renal tubular acidosis. Now, proximal renal tubular acidosis or type 2 renal tubular acidosis might be an isolated defect of bicarbonate reabsorption, or it might be associated with generalized proximal tubular dysfunction such as bicarbonaturia, phosphaturia, amino aciduria, uricosuriا, and glycosuria, then the famous Fanconi syndrome. However, there are other secondary causes of proximal RTA, which may include inborn errors of metabolism, certain drug or heavy metal intake. What is striking is that even vitamin D deficiency can be a cause of proximal RTA. Paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, myeloma, and less common causes would be Sjogren's. Similarly, distal RTA or type 1 RTA may have primary or secondary causes. The secondary causes mainly include the immunological causes like lupus, Sjogren's, or other drug intake or hypercalciuric conditions such as sarcoid. So we went ahead with further testing of the patient. The urine pH of the patient was found to be 5. As discussed, that urine pH less than 5.3 is indicative of a proximal RTA. We tested for other proximal tubular dysfunction. However, we could not find any evidence of significant phosphaturia or glucosuria. But what we found that there was amino aciduria present, and she had increased excretion of phenylalanine, glycine, serine, histidine, and lysine. So, also comparing it with other types of RTA, our patient somewhere lied in the proximal RTA spectrum with a low serum potassium, a urine pH at the time of acidosis being less than 5.3, other proximal tubular dysfunctions such as amino aciduria being present, although not global PCD dysfunction. An ultrasound abdomen showed no evidence of nephrocalcinosis or nephrolithiasis, and she also had a bone disease in the form of rickets. So coming back to our case, we have a patient who's 14-year-old with renal tubular acidosis. She has normal and anion gap metabolic acidosis, a serum potassium level on the lower side, a urine pH that is also on the lower side, less than 5.3, with clinical rickets, with urine amino aciduria, with hypouricemia. So that made us to diagnose the patient as having proximal renal tubular acidosis. Indeed, a further evaluation was done to rule out other secondary causes of proximal RTA as discussed. Urine for reducing sugars was absent. Immunological examination was absent, was within normal limits. ANA, rheumatoid factor, ENA, anti-Rho, anti-La, everything was negative. Serum globulins were within normal levels. An extensive ocular and ENT examination did not reveal any abnormality that could suggest any other inborn error of metabolism. We also went ahead with genetic testing of the patient in order to be sure of our diagnosis and rule out other secondary causes of RTA. A clinical exome sequencing was done for her. What was striking was that we found a mutation in the potassium channel KIR5.1, which was coded by the gene KCNJ16 gene. It was a frame shift mutation due to deletion of 2 base pairs that led to premature truncation of the protein that leads to coding of the potassium invert rectifier channel. What is striking is that this potassium channel has never been reported in humans to be a causative agent of proximal RTA, or for that matter hypokalemia with acidosis. However, mice studies when done for this gene have shown a similar phenotype as was there in our patient, and mice in whom KCN-J16 was deleted had proximal RTA with hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis with hypokalemia. So what they had classified it as a variation of uncertain significance, but to be sure whether this is the gene which is pathogenic or not, we would be working in close liaison with the genetics department to do a Sanger's confirmation of this gene. Once a Sanger's confirmation is done, we would like to do the segregation studies on the parents. And once we detect that, we would like to do protein modeling studies in liaison with biophysics department in order to establish the pathogenicity of this gene, as it will be the first ever the disorder that will be associated with this gene. So our final diagnosis would be a proximal renal tubular acidosis type 2 with severe hypokalemia with hypokalemic quadriparesis, which resolved in administration of potassium, severe vitamin D deficiency, clinical rickets, which could be secondary to vitamin D deficiency or secondary to proximal RTA, and a KCN-J16 mutation. Now, proximal RTA, now who should be blamed? Whether it is vitamin D deficiency or the potassium channel mutation, we'll see. She was managed in hospital by correction of acidosis and hypokalemia. Alkali syrup was given at doses of 10 milliequivalent per kg per day, and even vitamin D and calcium supplementation was done in view of vitamin D deficiency. An interim follow-up after 3 weeks was suggestive of normalization of bicarbonate levels. They reached up to 23.8. Potassium levels were also normalized, and there was significantly lesser degree of acidosis. She would be further followed up, and further testing and segregation studies will be done in order to know the pathogenicity. I would like to call now Dr. Harsh Sahu, who is a senior resident in Department of Medicine, to carry on the discussion forward and do a review of literature on the same.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now coming to review of literature. Nursing Rao et al. In South India published their experience of 31 cases of hypokalemic periodic paralysis. They discovered that out of 31, 13 patients had renal tubular acidosis, 13 had primary hyperaldosteronism. Other cause was thyrotoxic periodic paralysis, sporadic periodic paralysis, and Gentleman syndrome. Renal tubular acidosis is basically a group of transport defect resulting in impaired capacity of NAT acid excretion and persistent hypokalemic metabolic acidosis. It can be divided into 3 types. Type 1 is distal RTA, type 2 is proximal RTA, type 4 is the RTA secondary to hypoaldosteronism. RTA can be suspected in a patient with growth retardation, failure to thrive, polyuria and polydipsia, and in patient with refractory rickets, osteomalacia, or in patient presenting with weakness or paralysis due to hypokalemia. This was the presentation in our case. Type 1 RTA is due to impaired acid secretion in distal nephron. Normal ion gap, it causes normal ion gap metabolic acidosis. There is renal potassium wasting that causes hypokalemia. In cases, the hypokalemia can be so severe that it causes hypokalemic paralysis. There have been reports of such presentation there have been cases of hypokalemic paralysis presenting as the manifestation of primary Sjogren due to distal RTA causing severe hypokalemia. Type 2 RTA is due to reduced proximal bicarbonate resorption capacity. It may be accompanied by the reduced defective resorption of phosphate, uric acid, glucose, and amino acid. Basically, bicarbonate is absorbed in PCT from the basolateral membrane. There are many causes of proximal RTA. The cause that we explored were genetic cause. Genetics, it may be due to defect in proximal tubular cell sodium bicarbonate co-transporter, that is defect in NBCE1 receptor defect that is present in basolateral membrane of proximal convoluted tubule. This is due to mutation in gene SLC4A4 gene. There may be carbonic anhydrase type 2 deficiency. There may be defect in invert rectifier potassium channel 4.2 that is encoded by KCN-J15 mutation. The defect in rectifier potassium channel causes depolarization of primary convoluted tubule that result in lax bicarbonate absorption from NBCE1 gene, which result in increased cell pH and this dysregulation of protein that involve in aminogenesis. that cause proximal RTA that with the absence of generalized tubular dysfunction that was present in our patient. There have been multiple genes that are involved in proximal RTA and Fanconi syndrome. Our gene that we found in our patient was not in this list. The gene that we found our patient was KCN J16 gene, which is also an inverse rectified potassium channel gene that allows potassium to flow into the cell. It may function in fluid and pH balance. Its defect is associated with seizure disorder, sensory neural deafness, ataxia, and mental retardation, and occasionally with electrolyte imbalance. There is no human study on this, but on mice study, knockout mice that lacked this gene displayed hypokalemia, hypochloremic metabolic acidosis, and hypocalciuria. There are some of these electrolyte imbalance are also present in this patient. Other cause that we explored was vitamin D leading to this disease. Vitamin D can also cause renal tubular acidosis type 2. As discussed with Asin Ali in their case report, their patient had chronic weakness and electrolyte imbalance like hypokalemia, hypocalcemia, hypophosphatemia, acidemia, hypoparathyroidism that lead to weakness and body pain. The mechanism they postulated was the vitamin D deficiency will lead to low serum calcium and phosphorus and elevated ALP and PTS. This results in reduced bicarbonate recovery from PCT. This excess loss of bicarbonate and distal tubule will increase the renal flow rate that will cause mild hypovolemia that will activate RAS system. Also, distal nephron will increase the flow, will increase the potassium wasting, leading to hypokalemia. There has also been case report of proximal RTA and Fanconi syndrome that were treated with vitamin D replacement. So, what is the exact cause that we are not sure. So, treatment of type 2 RTA includes stop offending agent when present, treat the hypophosphatemia vitamin D deficiency, correct the metabolic acidosis. The dose of alkali required in these patients are quite high. It requires 10 to 15 millicurie per kg per day. Potassium supplement need to be given. Thiazide diuretic can be given to reduce the potassium wasting. With potassium sparing diuretic, thiazide diuretic can be given to reduce bicarbonate wasting. With potassium sparing diuretic to reduce the potassium loss. So the final diagnosis of our patient was proximal RTA type 2, severe hypokalemia with hypokalemic quadriparesis, severe vitamin D deficiency, rickets, clinical rickets due to vitamin D deficiency, and KCNJ16 mutation. What is the cause? Vitamin D deficiency or K16 mutation? That time will tell. So we like to acknowledge Division of Pediatric Nephrology, the Division of Genetics in Department of Pediatrics and Department of Nephrology. I invite Dr. Prayas to say something.
Thank you, Harsh and Shubham. So basically, I would like to highlight one point that vitamin D deficiency is one of the important, common and treatable causes of proximal tubule dysfunction. Though it rarely can cause proximal tubular acidosis, but it may have contributed to some amount of dysfunction that occurred in this event. So what we plan to do is we plan to replete the patient of vitamin D, stop all the therapy and observe the patient for the potassium levels and the bicarbonate and the acidosis status and see if she maintains that. And meanwhile, we also do the Sanger sequencing and establish the diagnosis of genetic cause of proximal RTA. I would like to call Professor Bagga sir for his experience on this.
I think it's a very worked up case, and I think it's well worked up. And I think from what you are saying, so there's definite hypokalemia.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as described by sir, today we'll be discussing an interesting case in which an IUCD was implanted inside the patient 25 years earlier, and we've discovered it incidentally. So the patient is Mrs. K, a 56-year-old female resident of Mohali. She's a homemaker. She presented with a history of pain in right iliac fossa, initially in the epigastrium but migrated to the right iliac fossa, a single episode which was 2 months back. The pain was moderate to severe in intensity, requiring intravenous analgesics. It was associated with anorexia, nausea and vomiting. However, there was no fever, no dysuria, hematuria, no jaundice or diarrhea. She had no previous complaints of the similar nature in the past. She's a known hypothyroid on tablet Eltroxin 25 micrograms. No history of diabetes, hypertension, no other chronic illnesses. She had no previous surgical history. She is postmenopausal since January 2013, prior to which her cycles were regular. She currently has 3 live issues, with the last birth being in 1993. A copper T was inserted in 93 after the last pregnancy. Her general examination was fairly normal. She did not have any tachycardia. She was afebrile. Her blood pressure was normal. When we come to the systemic examination, respiratory and cardiovascular systems were normal. Her abdominal examination was also normal. She had no tenderness in any localized area, no hepatosplenomegaly. Investigations which were done at the time of the pain revealed a normal leukocyte count of 7,100 per microliter. All other parameters were also normal. So our first imaging was an ultrasound, which did not reveal any appendix, which would be our primary diagnosis in this case. So a CT was done. The CT showed an appendix which measured 12 millimeters with wall thickness. No contrast was seen in the appendicular lumen, no appendicolith. Another interesting finding which was seen in the CT was an IUCD was noticed in the intraperitoneal region outside the uterus near the right adnexal area. So based on the clinical and imaging findings, our diagnosis would be a mild case of acute appendicitis and a migrated IUCD. Our plan would be diagnostic laparoscopy. However, a consent was taken for appendectomy, which was our initial diagnosis, the IUCD removal, and also due to the possibility that the IUCD could involve the surrounding structures, the bowel, we've also taken consent for possibility of bowel repair, resection anastomosis, and ostomy formation. The normal port insertion for laparoscopic appendectomy would be one port in the infraumbilical region, a 12 mm port would be introduced for telescope, 2 other ports, 5 mm ports in the left lower quadrant and a suprapubic area. This is a short video of the procedure in this very same patient. The telescope was introduced and diagnostic laparoscopy was done. At first notice, we only see adhesions were formed between omentum and the anterior abdominal wall. This is the adhesions. We do not see any IUCD on first notice. Next, we proceed to insert 2 other scopes in the suprapubic and the left lower quadrant region, both which are 5 mm ports. This is the second port. Now we are introducing the third port. Here we see an external view of the 3 laparoscopic ports. We see a suprapubic, an infraumbilical, and the left lower quadrant port. So we begin to tackle the adhesions which were present between the omentum and the anterior abdominal wall. We use ultrasonic shears of the harmonic probe. However, since the dissection was a little difficult, we proceed to look for the appendix. Here in the appendicular area, we do not see any periappendiceal adhesions. The appendix, the tubular structure we see is fairly normal, grossly normal looking, not inflamed, no adhesions surrounding it. However, due to the CT finding, we proceed with appendectomy. The mesoappendix is being ligated here with the harmonic probe. Once we've done that, our next step would be to identify the appendicular artery. Here, we are trying to skeletonize the appendicular artery with curved forceps. Once we have skeletonized the appendicular artery, we use metallic clips here. 2 metallic clips are applied proximally to ligate the appendicular artery. And once we are sure of the ligation, then we divide the appendicular artery distal to that. Next, we proceed to divide the appendix from its base. It can either be done with a stapler or an endoloop suture. Here we are doing with an Estelon blue stapler. We applied it at the base, ensured that the cecum was not involved inside the stapler, and the cartridge was fired. Now the separated divided appendix is delivered outside. This appendix was sent for histopath. Next, we come back to the dense adhesions which were present. No IUCD is still visible yet. We continue with the dissection. Here, this is the area where we first see the white tubular structure. This would be the copper T. We proceed with our dissection. This IUCD is completely buried inside the adhesions. However, fortunately, we do not have any bowel involved in the adhesions. Here we are using a hook with the coagulation function to separate the adhesions around the copper T. We are applying traction, counter traction to separate it from the adhesions. Finally, as we keep pulling it out, the copper T is finally separated. The thread is still stuck inside the adhesions, which will proceed to separate even the thread. Yeah, so we finally removed the copper T along with the thread completely. As we can see, there is very minimal blood loss. Yeah, here we can see the copper T completely. So after hemostasis was ensured, this was delivered outside and all the ports were removed under vision. The postoperative course of this patient was normal. She was mobilized on postoperative day 0, allowed orally on day 1, passed flatus on day 1. At discharge, she was taking orally, passing flatus stools. She was ambulatory and her vitals were stable. The histopathology report that was of the appendix specimen which was sent showed and confirmed our diagnosis of chronic appendicitis. Now I invite Dr. Moin to continue the discussion of foreign body migration.
Thank you, Dr. Ritwik. Good afternoon, everybody. Coming to the history of intrauterine contraceptive devices, in 1909, Richard Richter used silkworm threads as a method of contraception. Then, in 1962 came the Lippes loop. In 1988, copper T was introduced with the brand name of Paragard, and in 2000, Mirena was introduced. Coming to the demographic data, ranging from 2 to 40%, the worldwide usage of the IUCDs has been increasing ever since. A total of 175 million users around the globe are using IUCDs, but in India, generally terminal methods of contraception are preferred over temporary methods. Nonetheless, the IUCD numbers are still increasing in India also. IUCD can cause complications of pain, irregular bleeding, infection, expulsion, pregnancy, especially ectopic pregnancy, and a rare but still a catastrophic complication of uterine perforation and migration, though its incidence is only less than 1 per 1,000 insertions. So, where does the IUCD migrate? It goes into the urinary bladder, causing perforation, stone formation. It may end up in the pouch of Douglas, leading to adhesions and bowel obstruction. Around 13% still remains in the uterus and the broad ligament. And around 26% of the migrated IUCDs remain in the omentum, and around 50% causes catastrophic complications of the small bowel and large bowel. And a few cases of appendicitis have also been reported. So here are a few examples of the havoc caused by the IUCD. On the left, you have an IUCD perforating the small bowel, and on the right side, you can see that the IUCD has penetrated the sigmoid colon, and its threads have been found in the peritoneum. This is another case report of a IUCD which has perforated the the urinary bladder. The IUCD acts as a nidus of infection, and finally it ends up with a stone formation over the IUCD. So, how do these patients present? Around 50% of the patients present as asymptomatic patients, especially in developed countries where they have regular follow-up. These patients are generally asymptomatic, and when on regular follow-up they do not find the threads, they generally evaluated and found that the IUCD has migrated. And around 1/3 of the patients present with pregnancy. And 17% of the patients present with chronic abdominal pain of long-standing duration, and around minimal 44% of the patients present with vaginal bleed. So, the mechanism of the migration of the IUCD is not yet clear yet, but the factors that favor uterine perforation, like the uterine size, timing of the insertion, especially immediate postpartum, the congenital uterine anomalies as such are contraindication for IUCD placement, and generally females with who are breastfeeding have a soft and supple uterus, which generally has high risk of perforation. And factors favoring spontaneous migration are generally spontaneous uterine contractions, bowel peristalsis, and bladder contractions. At the pathological level, foreign body causes two types of reactions. One is the aseptic fibrinous response, which causes adhesions and encapsulations, and the second exudative response with secondary bacterial infections. This actually is a chain reaction which leads to recurrent inflammation and necrosis and intraluminal migration. These patients generally do not present with acute features of peritonitis because the recurrent infections and micronecrosis leads to formation of adhesion, and the intra-bowel fluid does not leak out, presenting as peritonitis. This case has been published and has been published by our department. We have experienced it, that a retained intra-abdominal drain placed 9 years before for the indication of open appendicectomy was passed per rectum without any operative intervention. So this is a case of aseptic involvement of the foreign body, where the long-standing foreign body has caused perforation, entered the lumen of the bowel, but still no acute symptoms. Patient was managed non-operatively, and he passed the drain per rectum the next day, and he was discharged the other day. Similarly, this is an unusual case of a mesh which was placed for hernia repair, eroded, got infected, and patient present to us with sepsis, and intraoperatively we have found that the bowel was involved and the bladder also was involved. The mesh, as you can see, had purulent exudate. It was extruded laparoscopically, and the resection anastomosis was done in this patient. So, how do you investigate a migrated IUCD? A plain radiograph can tell you that the IUCD is present intraperitoneally, but a CCT abdomen is the investigation of choice. It helps you to exactly locate, and also you can evaluate the complications like perforation or extensive bowel involvement and adhesions on the CCT abdomen. Hysteroscopy, colonoscopy, and cystoscopy nonetheless are very good adjuncts along with laparoscopy. Preoperative imaging is a must for deciding the site of the IUCD, and it also helps us, as already mentioned, the approach for the surgery. It's either open or laparoscopic. Management. Initially, people thought that an asymptomatic migrated IUCD need not be operated upon. Adoni et al. Felt that in their case series of 13 patients, they concluded that because the patient was asymptomatic, no active surgical intervention was needed in these patients. Similarly, Markovich was of the same opinion. However, this case report, which is published in the United Kingdom, showed that a forgotten migrated IUCD contraceptive device is not always innocent. This patient, a 67-year-old female patient, presented 30 years after the insertion of IUCD. She presented with acute abdomen, features of acute abdomen. And as you can see, there were dense adhesions intraoperatively around the omentum, which has led to the gangrene of the small bowel. So, the WHO recommends that surgical removal of all intraperitoneal IUCDs is a must. Laparoscopic approach is superior to open approach, and when you foresee complications like perforation or dense adhesion on the CT scan, it's preferably you go for an open approach. This is a systemic review of elective surgical removal of IUCDs compared open versus laparoscopic comparison. It's a case of review of 129 cases over 30 studies over 14 countries. They concluded that surgery is the treatment of choice in all migrated IUCDs, and laparoscopic approach is superior to the open approach. Here, another interesting case of IUCD, a migrated IUCD causing cecal perforation. This is a 35-year-old female patient who developed pregnancy in spite of having intrauterine IUCD. She wanted that the IUCD be removed after the pregnancy, and within 4 weeks into the postpartum period, she developed perforation in the cecum. Here you can see this is the vertical limb of the IUCD, and the transverse limbs are present in the cecum. And this is the perforation which the IUCD has caused, which was laparoscopically repaired intracorporeally. And the patient was discharged in a stable condition. So, what are the surgical options we have? Initially, when you foresee that the patient is a simple case without any adhesions, laparoscopic removal of the IUCD will suffice. But whereas when you think that the patient is complicated and a lot of adhesions, when you think that a lot of adhesions are going to be present, preferably a triple approach of endoscopy, example like in this case, hysteroscopy was performed, sigmoidoscopy was performed, and the IUCD was removed laparoscopically. So, in developing countries like India, where most of our rural healthcare system is completely dependent on the auxiliary health care providers, utmost importance should be given to proper training of the insertion of the IUCD, a good record keeping of these patients, a follow-up of first, third and sixth month after initial insertion, and an annual gynecological examination by a gynecologist should be performed. IUCD in countries like India, where the numbers are going on increasing, it's a simple, cheap and effective method of contraception. Patient education, especially about the follow-up and the complications which can arise because of the IUCD, should be mentioned to the patient beforehand. Migration, when occurs, can lead to catastrophic complications with severe morbidity. And prompt investigations and removal, preferably laparoscopic, is the treatment of choice. Thank you. Now I request Professor Neeta Singh.